Around the World in 80 Days, by Jules Verne, Chapter 10, in which Passepartout is only too glad to get off with the loss of his shoes. Everybody knows that the great reverse triangle of land, with its base in the north and its apex in the south, which is called India, embraces 1,400,000 square miles, upon which is spread unequally a population of 180 millions of souls. The British Crown exercises a real and despotic dominion over the larger portion of the vast country and has a Governor-General stationed in Calcutta, governors at Madras, Bombay, and in Bengal, and a Lieutenant Governor at Agra. But British India, properly so called, only embraces 700,000 square miles and a population from 100 to 110 million of inhabitants. A considerable portion of India is still free from British authority, and there are certain ferocious Rajas in the interior who are absolutely independent. The celebrated East India Company was all-powerful from 1756, when the English first gained a foothold on the spot where they now stands, the city of Madras. Down to the time of the great sepoy insurrection, it gradually annexed province after province, purchasing them of the native chiefs, whom it seldom paid, and appointed the Governor-General and his subordinates, civil and military. But the East Indian Company has now passed away, leaving the British possessions in India directly under the control of the Crown. The aspect of the country, as well as the manners and distinctions of race, is daily changing. Formerly, one was obliged to travel in India by the old cumbrous methods of going on foot or horseback, in palanquins or unwieldy coaches. Now fast steamboats ply on the Indus and the Ganges, and a great railway with branch lines joining the main line at many points on its route traverses the peninsula from Bombay to Calcutta in 3 days. This railway does not run in a direct line across India. The distance between Bombay and Calcutta, as the bird flies, is only from 1,000 to 1,100 miles, but the deflections of the road increase this distance by more than a third. The general route of the great Indian Peninsula Railways is as follows. Leaving Bombay, it passes through Salsit. Crossing to the continent opposite Tana, it goes over the chain of the Western Ghats and runs thence northeast as far as Brahmapur, skirts the nearly independent area of Bunslund, ascends to Allahabad, and turns thence eastwardly, meeting the Ganges at Benares, and then departs from the river a little, and descending southwardly by Burdivian and the French town of Chandernagore, and has its terminus at Calcutta. The passengers of the Mongolia went ashore at 4:30 p.m. At exactly 8, the train would start for Calcutta. Mr. Fogg, after bidding goodbye to his whist partners, left the steamer, gave his servant several errands to do, urged it upon him to be at the station promptly at 8, and with his regular step, which beat to the second, like an astronomical clock, directed his steps to the passport office. As for the wonders of Bombay, its famous city halls, its splendid libraries, its forts, its docks, its bazaars, mosques, and synagogues, its Armenian churches, and the noble pagoda on Malabar Hill, with its 2 polygonal towers, he cared not a straw to see them. He would not deign to examine even the masterpieces of El Infanta or the mysterious Hypogea, concealed southeast from the docks, or those fine remains of a Buddhist architecture, the Canarian grottos of the island Salsette. Having transacted his business in the passport office, Phileas Fogg repaired quietly to the railway station, where he ordered dinner. Among the dishes served up to him, the landlord especially recommended a certain giblet of native rabbit on which he prided himself. Mr. Fogg accordingly tasted the dish, but despite its spice sauce, found it far from palatable. He rang for the landlord, and on his appearance said, fixing his clear eyes upon him, "Is this rabbit, sir?" "Yes, my lord," the rogue boldly replied, "a rabbit from the jungles. And this rabbit did not mew when he was killed." "Mew, my lord. What a rabbit mew, I swear to you." "Be so good, landlord, as to not swear, but remember this. Cats were formerly considered in India as sacred animals, and that was a good time. For the cats, my lord, perhaps for the travellers as well." After which Mr. Fogg quietly continued his dinner. Fix had gone on shore shortly after Mr. Fogg, and his first destination was the headquarters of the Bombay police. He made himself known as a London detective, told his business at Bombay, asked the position of affairs relative to the supposed robber, and nervously asked if a warrant had arrived from London. It had not reached the office. Indeed, there had not yet been time for it to arrive. Fix was sorely disappointed, and tried to obtain an order of arrest from the director of the Bombay police. This the director refused, As the matter concerned the London office, which alone could legally deliver the warrant, Fix did not insist, and was fain to resign himself to await the arrival of the important document, but he was determined not to lose sight of a mysterious rogue as long as he stayed in Bombay. He did not doubt for a moment, any more than Passepartout, that Phileas Fogg would remain there, at least until it was time for the warrant to arrive. Passepartout, however, had no sooner heard his master's orders on leaving the Mongolia than he saw at once that they were going to leave Bombay as they had done Suez and Paris, and that the journey would be extended at least as far as Calcutta, perhaps beyond that place. He began to ask himself if this bet Mr. Fogg talked about was not really in good earnest, and whether his fate was not in truth forcing him, despite his love of repose, around the world in 80 days. Having purchased the usual quota of shirts and shoes, he took a leisurely promenade around the streets, where crowds of people, of many nationalities, Europeans, Persians with pointed caps, Benyans with round turbans, Sindhis with square bonnets, Parsis with black mitres, and long-robed Armenians were collected. It happened to be the day after a Parsi festival. These descendants of the sect of Zoroaster, the most thrifty, civilized, intelligent, and austere of the East Indians, among whom are counted the richest native merchants of Bombay, were celebrating a sort of religious carnival with processions and shows, in the midst of which Indian dancing girls, clothed in perfect modesty, to the sound of viols and the clanging of tambourines. It is needless to say that Passepartout watched these curious ceremonies with staring eyes and gaping mouth, and that his countenance was that of the greenest booby imaginable. Unhappily for his master, as well as himself, his curiosity drew him unconsciously farther off than he intended to go. At last, having seen the Parsi carnival wind away in the distance, he was turning his steps towards the station, when he happened to espy the splendid pagoda on Malabar Hill, and was seized with an irresistible desire to see its interior. He was quite ignorant that it is forbidden to Christians to enter certain Indian temples, and that even the faithful must not go in without first leaving their shoes outside the door. It may be said here that the wise policy of the British government severely punishes a disregard of the practices of the native religions. Passepartout, however, thinking no harm, went in like a simple tourist, and was soon lost in admiration of the splendid Brahmin ornamentation which everywhere met his eyes, when all of a sudden he found himself sprawling on the sacred flagging. He looked up to behold 3 enraged priests, who forthwith fell upon him, tore off his shoes, and began to beat him with loud, savage exclamations. The agile Frenchman was soon upon his feet again, and lost no time knocking down 2 of his long-gowned adversaries with his fists and a vigorous application of his toes. Then, rushing out of the pagoda as fast as his legs could carry him, he soon escaped the 3rd priest by mingling with the crowd in the streets. At 5 minutes before 8, Passepartout, hatless, shoeless, and having in the squabble lost his package of shirts and shoes, rushed breathlessly into the station. Fix, who had followed Mr. Fogg to the station, and saw that he was really going to leave Bombay, was there, upon the platform. He had resolved to follow the supposed robber to Calcutta, and farther if necessary. Passepartout did not observe the detective, who stood in an obscure corner, but Fix heard him relate his adventures in a few words to Mr. Fogg. "I hope that this will not happen again," said Phileas Fogg coldly, as he got into the train. Poor Passepartout, quite crestfallen, followed his master without a word. Fix was on the point of entering another carriage when an idea struck him which induced him to alter his plan. "Now I'll stay," muttered he. "An offence has been committed on Indian soil. I've got my man." Just then the locomotive gave a sharp screech, and the train passed out into the darkness of the night. End of Chapter 10. Chapter 11, in which Phileas Fogg secures a curious means of conveyance at a fabulous price. The train had started punctually. Among the passengers were a number of officers, government officials, and opium and indigo merchants, whose business called them into the eastern coast. Passepartout rode in the same carriage with his master. A 3rd passenger occupied a seat to them. This was Sir Francis Cromarty, one of Mr. Fogg's whist partners on the Mongolia, now on his way to join his corps at Benares. Sir Francis was a tall, fair man of 50 who had greatly distinguished himself at the last Sepoy revolt. He made India his home, only paying brief visits to England at rare intervals, and was almost as familiar as a native with the customs, history, and character of India and its people. But Phileas Fogg, who was not travelling, but only describing a circumference, took no pains to inquire into these subjects. He was a solid body, transversing an orbit around the terrestrial globe. According to the laws of rational mechanics, he was at this moment calculating in his mind the number of hours spent since his departure from London, and, had it been in his nature to make a useless demonstration, he would have rubbed his hands for satisfaction. Sir Francis Cromarty had observed the oddity of his travelling companion, though the only opportunity he had for studying him had been while he was dealing the cards, and between two rubbers, and questioned himself whether a human heart really beat beneath this cold exterior, and whether Phileas Fogg had any sense of the beauties of nature. The Brigadier General was free to mentally confess that, of all the eccentric persons he had ever met, none was comparable to the product of this exact sciences. Phileas Fogg had not concealed from Sir Francis his design of going around the world, nor the circumstances under which he set out, and the General only saw in the wager a useless eccentricity and a lack of sound common sense. In the way this strange gentleman was going on, he would leave the world without having done any good to himself or anybody else. And now, after leaving Bombay, the train had passed the viaducts and the island of Salsette, and had gone into the open country. At Calvan they reached the junction of the branch line which descends towards southeastern India by Kandala and Poona, and, passing Palwell, they entered the defiles of the mountains with their basalt bases and their summits crowned with thick and verdant forests. Phileas Fogg and now Sir Francis Cromarty exchanged a few words from time to time, and now Sir Francis, reviving the conversation, observed, "Some years ago, Mr. Fogg, you would have met with delay at this point, which would have probably cost you your wager." "How so, Mr. Francis?" "Because the railway stopped at the base of these mountains, which all the passengers were obliged to cross in palanquins or ponies to Kandala on the other side." "Such a delay would have not deranged my plans in the least," said Mr. Fogg. "I have constantly foreseen the likelihood of certain obstacles." "But, Mr. Fogg," pursued Sir Francis, "you run the risk of having some difficulty about this worthy fellow's adventure at the pagoda." Passepartout, his feet comfortably wrapped in his travelling blanket, was sound asleep and did not dream that anybody was talking about him. "The government is very severe upon that kind of offence. It takes particular care that the religious customs of the Indians should be respected, and if your servant were caught—" "Very well, Sir Francis," replied Mr. Fogg. "If he had been caught, he would have been condemned and punished. Then he would have quietly returned to Europe. I don't see how this affair could have delayed his master." The conversation fell again. During the night the train left the mountains behind and passed Nasik, and the next day proceeded over the flat, well-cultivated country of the Khandish, with its straggling villages, above which rose the minarets of the pagodas. This fertile territory is watered by numerous small rivers and limpid streams, mostly tributaries of the Godavari. Passepartout, on waking and looking out, could not realize that he was actually crossing India in a railway train. The locomotive, guided by an English engineer and fed with English coal, threw out its smoke upon cotton, coffee, nutmeg, clove and pepper plantations, while the steam curled in spirals around groups of palm trees, in the midst of which were seen picturesque bungalows, viharis, sort of abandoned monasteries, and marvelous temples enriched by the exhaustless ornamentation of Indian architecture. Then they came upon vast tracts extending to the horizon, with jungles inhabited by snakes and tigers, which fled at the noise of the train, succeeded by forest penetrating by the railway, and still haunted by elephants which, with pensive eyes, gazed at the train as it passed. The travellers crossed beyond Miligam, the fatal country so often stained with the blood by the sectaries of the goddess Kali. Not far off rose Ellora, with its graceful pagodas, and the famous Aurungabad, capital of the ferocious Aurangzeb, now the chief town in one of the detached provinces of the kingdom of the Nizam. It was thereabouts that Feringe, the thuggy chief, king of stranglers, held his sway. Those ruffians, united by a secret bond, strangled victims of every age in honor of the goddess Death, without ever shedding blood. There was a period when this part of the country could scarcely be travelled over without corpses being found in every direction. The English government has succeeded in greatly diminishing these murders, though the thuggies still exist and pursue the exercise of their horrible rights. At 12:30, the train stopped in Burhampur, where Passepartout was able to purchase some Indian slippers, ornamented with false pearls, in which, with evident vanity, he proceeded to encase his feet. The travellers made a hasty breakfast and started off for Asogur, after skirting for a little the banks of the small river Tapti, which empties into the Gulf of Cambrai near Surat. Passepartout was now plunged into the absorbing revelry. Up to his arrival at Bombay, he had entertained hopes that their journey would end there, but now that they were plainly whirling across India at full speed, a sudden change had come over the spirit of his dreams. His old vagabond nature returned to him. The fantastic idea of his youth once more took possession of him. He came to regard his master's project as intended in good earnest. believed in the reality of the bet, and therefore in the tour of the world and the necessity of making it without fail within the designated period. Already he began to worry about possible delays and accidents which might happen along the way. He recognized himself as being personally interested in the wager, and trembled at the thought that he might have been the means of losing it by his unpardonable folly of the night before. Being much less cool-headed than Mr. Fogg, he was much more restless, counting and recounting the days passed over, uttering maledictions when the train stopped and accusing it of sluggishness, and mentally blaming Mr. Fogg for not having bribed the engineer. The worthy fellow was ignorant that, while it was possible by such means to hasten the rate of a steamer, it could not be done on the railway. The train entered the defiles of the Subtor Mountains, which separate the Candiche from Bundelkund, towards evening. The next day Sir Francis Cromarty asked Passepartout what time it is, to which, on consulting his watch, he replied that it was 3 a.m. This famous timepiece, always regulated on the Greenwich meridian, which was now some 76 degrees westward, was at least 4 hours slow. Sir Francis corrected Passepartout's time, whereupon the latter made the same remark that he had done to Fix, and upon the general insisting that the watch should be regulated in each new meridian, since he was constantly going eastward, that is, in the face of the sun, and therefore the days were shorter by 4 minutes for each degree gone over. Passepartout obstinately refused to alter his watch, which he kept at London time. It was an innocent delusion which could harm no one. The train stopped at 8 o'clock, in the midst of a glade some 15 miles beyond Rothal, where there were several bungalows and workmen's cabins. The conductor, passing along the carriages, shouted, "Passengers will get out here." Phileas Fogg looked at Sir Francis Cromarty for an explanation, but the gentleman could not tell what it meant and a halt in the middle of this forest of dates and acacias. Passepartout, not less surprised, rushed out and speedily returned, crying, "Monsieur, no more railway." "What do you mean?" asked Sir Francis. "I mean to say that the train isn't going on." The General at once stepped out, while Phileas Fogg calmly followed behind him, and they proceeded together to the conductor. "Where are we?" asked Sir Francis. "At the hamlet of Colby." "Do we stop here?" "Certainly. The railway isn't finished." "What? Not finished? No. It's still a matter of 50 miles to be laid from here to Allahabad, where the line begins again." "But the papers announced the opening of the railway throughout." "What would you have, officer? The papers were mistaken." "You sell tickets from Bombay to Calcutta," retorted Sir Francis, who was growing warm. "No doubt," replied the conductor, "but the passengers know that they must provide means of transportations from themselves from Colby to Allahabad." Sir Francis was furious. Passepartout would willingly have knocked out the conductor down, and did not dare look at his master. "We will, if you please, look about for some means of conveyance to Allahabad." "Mr. Fogg, this is delay greatly to your disadvantage." "No, Sir Francis, it was foreseen." "What? You knew that the way—" "No, not at all. But I knew some obstacle or other would sooner or later arise in my road. Nothing, therefore, is lost. I have 2 days, which I have already gained, to sacrifice. A steamer leaves Calcutta for Hong Kong at noon. On the 25th, this is the 22nd, and we shall reach Calcutta in time." There was nothing to say to so confident a response. But it was too true that the railway came to a termination at this point. The papers were like some watches, which have a way of getting too fast, and had been premature in their announcement of the completion of the line. The greater part of the travellers were aware of this interruption, and, leaving the train, they began to engage such vehicles as the village could provide: 4-wheel platt-garis, wagons drawn by zebus, carriages that looked like perambulating pagodas, palanquins, ponies, and what-not. Mr. Fogg and Sir Francis Cromarty, after searching the village from end to end, came back without having found anything. "I shall go afoot," said Phileas Fogg. Passepartout, who now had rejoined his master, made a wry grimace, as he thought of his magnificent but too frail Indian shoes. Happily, he too had been looking about him, and after a moment's hesitation said, "Monsieur, I think I have found the means of conveyance." "What?" An elephant that belongs to an Indian who lives but 100 steps from here." "Let's go see the elephant," replied Mr. Fogg. As soon as they reached a small hut near which, enclosed within some high palings, was the animal in question, an Indian came out of the hut, and, at their request, conducted them within the enclosure. The elephant, which the owner had reared, not for beast of burden, but for warlike purposes, was half domesticated. The Indian had begun already, by often irritating him, and feeding him every 3 months on sugar and butter, to impart him with a ferocity not in his nature. This method being often employed by those who trained the Indian elephants for battle. Happily, however, for Mr. Fogg, the animal's instruction in this direction had not gone far, and the elephant still preserved his natural gentleness. Keone, this was the name of the beast, could doubtless travel rapidly for a long time, and, in default, or of any other means of conveyance, Mr. Fogg resolved to hire him. But elephants are far from cheap in India, where they are becoming scarce. The males, which are alone suitable for circus shows, are much sought, especially, but as few of them are domesticated. When therefore Mr. Fogg proposed to the Indian to hire Keone, he refused point blank. Mr. Fogg persisted, offering an excessive sum of £10 an hour for the loan of the beast to Allahabad. Refused. £20. Refused also. £40 still refused. Passepartout jumped at each advanced, but the Indian declined to be tempted. Yet the offer was an alluring one, for supposing it took the elephant 15 hours to reach Allahabad, his owner would receive no less than £600 sterling. Phileas Fogg, without getting in the least flurried, then proposed to purchase the animal outright, and at first offered £1,000 for him. The Indian, perhaps thinking he was going to make a great bargain, still refused. Sir Francis Cromarty took Mr. Fogg aside and begged him to reflect more before he went any further, to which that gentleman replied that he was not in the habit of acting rashly, that a bet of £20,000 was at stake, and that the elephant was absolutely necessary to him, and that he would secure him if he had to pay 20 times his value. Returning to the Indian, whose small, sharp eyes glistened with avarice, betrayed that with him it was only a question of how great a price he could obtain. Mr. Fogg offered first £1,200, then £1,500, £1,800, £2,000. Passepartout, usually so rubicund, was fairly white with suspense. At £2,000 the Indian yielded. "What a price, good heavens!" cried Passepartout, "for an elephant." It only remained now to find a guide, which was comparatively easy. A young Parsee with an intelligent face offered his services, which Mr. Fogg accepted, promising so generous a reward as to materially stimulate his zeal. The elephant was led out and equipped. The Parsee, who was an accomplished elephant driver, covered his back with sort of a saddle-cloth, and attached to each of his flanks some curiously uncomfortable howdahs. Phileas Fogg paid the Indian with some banknotes which he extracted from the famous carpet-bag, a proceeding that seemed to deprive poor Passepartout of his vitals. Then he offered to carry Sir Francis to Allahabad, which the brigadier gratefully accepted, as one traveller the more would not be likely to fatigue the gigantic beast. Provisions were purchased at Kulbi, and while Sir Francis and Mr. Fogg took the howdahs on either side, Passepartout got astride the saddlecloth between them. The Parsee perched himself on the elephant's neck, and at 9 o'clock they set out from the village, the animal marching off through the dense forest of the palms by the shortest cut. End of Chapter 11. Around the World in 80 Days, by Jules Verne. Chapter 12, in which Phileas Fogg and his companions venture across the Indian forests, and what ensued. In order to shorten their journey, the guide passed to the left of the line where the railway was still in process of being built. This line, owing to the capricious turnings of the Vindalia Mountains, did not pursue a straight course. The Parsee, who was quite familiar with the roads and paths in the district, declared that they would gain 20 miles by striking directly through the forest. Phileas Fogg and Sir Francis Cromarty plunged to the neck of the peculiar howdahs provided for them, were horribly jousted by the swift trotting of the elephant, spurred on as he was by the skilful Parsee. But they endured the discomfort with true British phlegm, talking little, and scarcely able to catch a glimpse of each other. As for Passepartout, who was mounted on the beast's back and received the direct force of each concussion as he trod along, he was very careful, in accordance with his master's advice, to keep his tongue from between his teeth, as it would otherwise have been bitten off. The worthy fellow bounced from the elephant's neck to his rump and vaulted like a clown on a springboard, yet he laughed in the midst of his bouncing, and from time to time took a piece of sugar out of his pocket and inserted it in Keone's trunk, who received it without the least slackening of his regular trot. After 2 hours the guide stopped the elephant, and gave him an hour for rest, during which Keone, after quenching his thirst at a neighbouring spring, set to devouring the branches and shrubs around him. Neither Sir Francis nor Mr. Fogg regretted the delay, and both descended with a feeling of relief. "Why, he's made of iron," exclaimed the general, gazing admirably on Keone. "Of forged iron," replied Passepartout, as he set about preparing a hasty breakfast. At noon the Parsee gave the signal of departure. The country soon presented a very savage aspect. Copses of dates and dwarf farms succeeded the dense forests, then vast dry plains dotted with scanty shrubs, and sown with great blocks of siennet. All this portion of Bundelkund, which is little frequented by travellers, is inhabited by a fanatical population, hardened in the most horrible practices of the Hindu faith. The English have not yet begun to secure complete dominion over this territory, which is subjected to the influence of Rajas, who it is almost impossible to reach in their inaccessible mountain fastness. The travelers several times saw bands of ferocious Indians, who, when they perceived the elephant striding cross-country, made angry, arid, threatening motions. The Parsee avoided them as much as possible. Few animals were observed on the route. Even the monkeys hurried from their path with contortions and grimaces which convulsed Passepartout with laughter. In the midst of his gaiety, however, one thought troubled the worthy servant. What would Mr. Fogg do with the elephant when he got to Allahabad? Would he carry it on with him? Impossible. The cost of transporting him would make him ruinously expensive. Would he sell him or set him free? The estimable beast certainly deserved some consideration. Should Mr. Fogg choose to make him, Passepartout, a present of Chione, he would much be very embarrassed, and these thoughts did not cease worrying him for a long time. The principal chain of the Vindhyas was crossed by 8 in the evening. Another halt was made on the northern slope, in a ruined bungalow. They had gone nearly 25 miles that day, and equal distance still separated them from the station of Allahabad. The night was cold. The Parsee lit a fire in the bungalow with a few dry branches, and the warmth was very grateful. Provisions purchased at Colby sufficed for supper, and the travellers ate ravenously. The conversation, beginning with a few disconnected phrases, soon gave place to loud and steady snores. The guide watched Chione, who slept standing, bolstering himself against the trunk of a large tree. Nothing occurred during the night to disturb the slumbers, although the occasional growls from panthers and chatterings of monkeys broke the silence. The more formidable beasts made no cries or hostile demonstration against the occupants of the bungalow. Sir Francis slept heavily, like an honest soldier overcome with fatigue. Passepartout was wrapped in the uneasy dreams of bouncing the day before. As for Mr. Fogg, he slumbered as peacefully as if he had been in a serene mansion on Savile Row. The journey was resumed at 6 in the morning. The guide hoped to reach Allahabad by the evening. In that case, Mr. Fogg would only lose a part of 48 hours saved since the beginning of the tour. Chione, resuming his rapid gait, soon descended the lower spurs of the Vindhyas, and towards noon they passed the village of Callender, on the Cani, or other branches of the Ganges. The guide avoided inhabited places, thinking it safer to keep the open country, which lies along the first depressions of the basin of the great river. Allahabad was now only 12 miles to the northeast. They stopped under a clump of bananas, the fruit of which was healthy as bread, as succulent as cream, and amply partaken of and appreciated. At 2 o'clock the guide entered a thick forest, which extended several miles. He preferred to travel under the cover of the woods. They had not as yet had any unpleasant encounters, and the journey seemed on the point of being successfully accomplished, when the elephant, becoming restless, suddenly stopped, when it was 4 o'clock. "What's the matter?" asked Sir Francis, putting out his head. "I don't know, officer," replied the Parsee, listening attentively to a confused murmur which came through the thick branches. The murmur soon became more distinct. It now seemed like a distant concert of human voices accompanied by brass instruments. Passepartout was all eyes and ears. Mr. Fogg patiently waited without a word. The Parsee jumped to the ground, fastened the elephant to a tree, and plunged into the thicket. He soon returned, saying, "A procession of Brahmins is coming this way. We must prevent their seeing us if possible." The guide unloosed the elephant and led him into a thicket, at the same time asking the travellers not to stir. He held himself ready to bestride the animal at a moment's notice, should flight become necessary. But he evidently thought that the procession of the faithful would pass without perceiving them amid the thick foliage, which they were wholly concealed. The discordant tones of the voices and instruments drew nearer. Now droning songs mingled with the sound of tambourines and cymbals. The head of the procession soon appeared beneath the trees, 100 paces away, and the strange figures who performed the religious ceremony were easily distinguished through the branches. First came the priests, with mitres on their head and clothed in long lace robes. They were surrounded by men, women, and children, who sang a kind of lugubrious psalm, interrupted at regular intervals by the tambourines and cymbals, while behind them was drawn a car with large wheels, the spokes of which represented serpents entwined within each other. Upon the car, which was drawn by 4 richly caparisoned zebus, stood a hideous statue with 4 arms, the body colored dull red, with haggard eyes, dishevelled hair, protruding tongue, and lips tinted with betel. It stood upright upon the figure of a prostrate and headless giant. Sir Francis, recognizing the statue, whispered, "The goddess Kali, the goddess of love and death." "Of death, perhaps," muttered back Passepartout, "but of love, that ugly old hag? Never." The Parsee made a motion to keep silence. A group of old fakirs were capering and making a wild ado around the statue. These were striped with ochre and covered with the cuts whence their blood issued drop by drop. Stupid fanatics, who in the great Indian ceremonies still throw themselves under the wheels of Juggernaut. Some Brahmins, clad in all the sumptuous of Oriental apparel, and leading a woman who faltered at every step followed. This woman was young, and as fair as European. Her neck and head, shoulders, ears, arms, hands, and toes were loaded down with jewels and gems, with bracelets, earrings, and rings, while a tunic bordered with gold and covered with a light muslin robe betrayed the outline of her form. The guards who followed the young woman presented a violent contrast to her. Armed they were with naked sabres hung at their waists, and long Damascus pistols, bearing a corpse on a palanquin. It was the body of an old man, gorgeously arrayed in the habiliments of a Rajah, wearing as in life a turban embroidered with pearls, a robe of tissue and silk and gold, a scarf of cashmere sewed with diamonds, and the magnificent weapon of a Hindu prince. Next came the musicians, and a rear guard of capering fakirs, whose cries sometimes drowned out the noise of instruments. These closed the procession. Sir Francis watched the procession with a sad countenance, and turning to the guide, said, "A suttee." The Parsi nodded, and put a finger to his lips. The procession slowly wound under the trees, and soon its last ranks disappeared in the depths of the wood. The songs gradually died away. Occasionally cries were heard in the distance, until at last all was silence again. Phileas Fogg had heard what Sir Francis said, and as soon as the procession had disappeared, asked, "What's a suttee?" "A suttee," returned the gentleman, "is a human sacrifice, but a voluntary one. The woman you have just seen will be burned tomorrow at the dawn of day." "Oh, the scoundrels!" cried the Passepartout, who could not repress his indignation. "And the corpse?" asked Mr. Fogg. "Is that of the prince, her husband," said the guide, "an independent Rajah of Bundelkund." "Is it possible," resumed Phileas Fogg, his voice betraying not the least emotion, "that these barbarous customs still exist in India, and the English have been unable to put a stop to them?" "These sacrifices do not occur in the larger portion of India," replied Sir Francis, "but we have no power over these savage territories, and especially here in Bundelkund. The whole district north of the Vendiers is the theatre of incessant murders and pillage." "The poor wretch," exclaimed Passepartout, "to be burned alive." "Yes," returned Sir Francis, "burned alive, and, if she were not, you cannot conceive what a treatment she would be obliged to submit for from her relatives. They would shave off her hair, feed her a scanty allowance of rice, treat her with contempt. She would be looked upon as an unclean creature. She would die in some corner like a scurvy dog. The prospect of so frightful existence drives these poor creatures to the sacrifice of much more than love or religious fanaticism. Sometimes, however, the sacrifice is really voluntary, and it requires the active interference of the government to prevent it. Several years ago, when I was living at Bombay, a young widow asked permission of the governor to be burned along with her husband's body, but as you may imagine, he refused. The woman left town and took refuge with an independent Rajah, and there carried out her self-devoted purpose. While Sir Francis was speaking, the guide shook his head several times and now said, "The sacrifice which will take place tomorrow at dawn is not a voluntary one." "How do you know?" "Everybody knows about this affair in Bundelkund." "But the wretched creature did not seem to be making any resistance," observed Sir Francis. "That was because they had intoxicated her with fumes of hemp and opium. What way are they taking her?" "To the Bakoda of the Pilage, to Marasong. She will pass the night there." "And the sacrifice will take place tomorrow, at the first light of dawn." The guide now led the elephant out of the thicket and leaped upon his neck. Just at the moment when he was about to urge Kearney forward with a particular whistle, Mr. Fogg stopped him, and turning to Sir Francis Cromarty, said, "Suppose we save this woman." "Save the woman, Mr. Fogg?" "I yet have 12 hours to spare. I can devote them to that." "Why, you are a man of heart." "Sometimes," replied Phileas Fogg quietly, "when I have the time." End of Chapter 12. Chapter 13, in which Passepartout receives a new proof that fortune favors the brave. The project was a bold one, full of difficulty, perhaps impracticable. Mr. Fogg was going to risk life, or at least liberty, and therefore the success of his tour, but he did not hesitate, and he found in Sir Francis Cromarty an enthusiastic ally. As for Passepartout, he was ready for anything that might be proposed. His master's idea charmed him. He perceived the heart, a soul under that icy exterior. He began to love Phileas Fogg. There remained the guide. What course would he adopt? Would he not take part with the Indians? In default of his assistance, it was necessary to be assured of his neutrality. Sir Francis frankly put the question to him. "Officer," replied the guide, "I am a Parsi, and this woman is a Parsi. Command me as you will." "Excellent," said Mr. Fogg. "However," resumed the guide, "it is certain not only that we will risk our lives, but the horrible tortures if we are taken." "That is foreseen," replied Mr. Fogg. "I think we must wait till nightfall before acting." "I think so." The worthy Indian then gave some account of the victim, who, he said, was a celebrated beauty of the Parsi race, and the daughter of a wealthy Bombay merchant. She had received a thoroughly English education in that city, and from her manners and intelligence, was thought to be a European. Her name was Aouda. Left an orphan, she was married against her will to the old Rajah of Bundelkund, and, knowing the fate that awaited her, she escaped, was retaken and devoted by the Rajah's relatives, who had an interest in her death, to the sacrifice from which it seemed she could not escape. The Parsi's narrative only confirmed Mr. Fogg's and his companions in their generous design. It was decided that the guide should direct the elephant towards the pagoda of the Palaji, after which he accordingly approached as quickly as possible. They halted. Half an hour afterwards, in a copse some 500 feet from the pagoda, where they were well concealed, they could hear the groans and cries of the fakirs distinctly. Then they discussed the means of getting the victim. The guide was familiar with the pagoda of the Palaji, in which, as he declared, the young woman was imprisoned. Could they enter any of its doors while the whole party of Indians was plunged into drunken sleep, or was it safer to attempt to make a hole in the walls? This could only be determined at the moment and the place themselves, but it was certain that the abduction must be made at night, and not when, at break of day, the victim was to be led to her funeral pyre. Then no human intervention could save her. As soon as night fell, about 6 o'clock, they decided to make a reconnaissance around the pagoda. The cries of the fakirs were just ceasing. The Indians were in the act of plunging themselves into the drunkenness caused by liquid opium mingled with hemp, and it might be possible to slip between them to the temple itself. The Parsi, leading the others, noiselessly crept through the wood, and in 10 minutes they found themselves on the banks of a small stream, whence, by the light of the rosin torches, they perceived a pyre of wood, on top of which lay the embalmed body of the Rajah, who was to be burned with his wife. The pagoda, whose minarets loomed above the trees in the deepening dusk, stood 100 steps away. "Come," whispered the guide. He slipped more cautiously than ever through the brush, followed by his companions. The silence around was only broken by the low murmuring of the wind among the branches. Soon the Parsi stopped on the borders of the glade, which was lit up by the torches. The ground was covered by the groups of Indians, motionless in their drunken sleep. It seemed a battlefield strewn with the dead. Men, women, and children lay together. In the background, among the trees, the pagoda of the Palaji loomed distinctly. Much to the guide's disappointment, the guards of the Rajah, lighted by torches, were watching at the doors and marching to and fro with naked sabers. Probably the priests, too, were watching within. The Parsi, now convinced that it was impossible to force an entrance to the temple, advanced no farther, but led his companions back again. Phileas Fogg and Sir Francis Cromarty also saw that nothing could be attempted in that direction. They stopped and engaged in a whispered colloquy. "It's only 8 now," said the brigadier, "and his guards may also go to sleep." "It is not impossible," returned the Parsi. They lay down at the foot of a tree and waited. The time seemed long. The guide ever and anon left them to take an observation on the edge of the wood, but the guards watched steadily by the glare of the torches, and a dim light crept through the windows of the pagoda. They waited until midnight, but no change took place among the guards, and it became apparent that their yielding to sleep could not be counted on. The other plan must be carried out. An opening in the walls of the pagoda must be made. It remained to ascertain whether the priests were watching by the side of their victim as assiduously as the guards were at the door. After a last consultation, the guide announced that he was ready for the attempt and advanced, followed by the others. They took a roundabout way so as to get the pagoda on the rear. They reached the walls about 12:30. Without having met anyone, there was no guard. There were neither windows or doors. The night was dark. The moon, on the wane, scarcely left the horizon, and was covered with heavy clouds. The height of the trees deepened the darkness. It was not enough to reach the walls. An opening in them must be accomplished, and to attain this purpose the party only had their pocket knives. Happily, the temple walls were built of brick and wood, which could be penetrated with little difficulty. After one brick had been taken out, the rest would yield easily. They set noiselessly to work, and the Parsi on one side and Passepartout on the other began to loosen the brick so as to make a sudden aperture 2 feet wide. They were getting on rapidly when suddenly a cry was heard in the interior of the temple, followed almost instantly by other cries replying from the outside. Passepartout and the guide had stopped. Had they been heard? Was the alarm being given? Common prudence urged them to retire, and they did so, followed by Phileas Fogg and Sir Francis. They again hid themselves in the wood, and waited till the disturbance, whatever it may be, ceased, holding themselves ready to resume their attempt without delay. But awkwardly enough, the guards now appeared at the rear of the temple, and there installed themselves in readiness to prevent a surprise. It would be difficult to describe the disappointment of the party. Thus interrupted in their work, they could now not reach the victim. How then could they save her? Sir Francis shook his fists. Passepartout was beside himself, and the guide gnashed his teeth with rage. The tranquil Fogg waited without betraying any emotion. "We have nothing to do but to go away," whispered Sir Francis. "Nothing but to go away," echoed the guide. "Stop," said Fogg. "I'm only due at Allahabad before tomorrow noon." "But what can you hope to do?" asked Sir Francis. "In a few hours it will be daylight, and the chance which now seems lost may present itself at the last moment." Sir Francis would have liked to read Phileas Fogg's eyes. What was this cool Englishman thinking of? Was he planning to make a rush for the young woman at the very moment of the sacrifice, and boldly snatch her from her executioners? This would be utter folly, and it was hard to admit that Fogg was such a fool. Sir Francis consented, however, to remain to the end of this terrible drama. The guide led them to the rear of the glade, where they were able to observe the sleeping groups. Meanwhile, Passepartout, who had perched himself in the lower branches of a tree, was resolving an idea which first struck him in like a flash, and which was now firmly lodged in his brain. He had commenced by saying to himself, "What folly?" And then he repeated, "Why not, after all? It's a chance, perhaps the only one, and with such sorts." Thinking thus, he slipped, with the suppleness of a serpent, to the lowest branches, the ends of which bent almost to the ground. The hours passed, and the lighter shades now announced the approach of day. There was not yet light. This was the moment. The slumbering multitude became animated. The tambourines sounded, songs and cries arose. The hour of the sacrifice had come. The doors of the pagoda swung open, and a bright light escaped from its interior, in the midst of which Mr. Fogg and Sir Francis espied the victim. She seemed, having shaken off the stupor of intoxication, to be striving to escape from her executioner. Sir Francis's heart throbbed, and convulsively seizing Mr. Fogg's hand, found in it an open knife. Just at this moment the crowd began to move. The young woman had again fallen into stupor caused by the fumes of hemp, passed among the fakirs, who escorted her with wild religious cries. Phileas Fogg and his companions, mingling in the rear ranks of the crowd, followed, and in 2 minutes they reached the banks of the stream and stopped 50 paces from the pyre, upon which still lay the Rajah's corpse. In the semi-obscurity they saw the victim, quite senseless, stretched out beside her husband's body. Then a torch was brought, and the wood, heavily soaked with oil, instantly took fire. At this moment, Sir Francis and the guide seized Phileas Fogg, who in an instant of mad generosity was about to rush upon the pyre, but he had quickly pushed them aside, when the whole scene suddenly changed. A cry of terror rose. The whole multitude prostrated themselves, terror-stricken on the ground. The old Rajah was not dead. Then, since he rose all of a sudden, like a spectre, took up the wife in his arms, and descended from the pyre in the midst of the clouds of smoke, which only heightened his ghostly appearance. Fakirs and soldiers and priests, seized with instant terror, lay there, with their faces on the ground, not daring to lift their eyes and behold such a prodigy. The inanimate victim was borne alone by the vigorous arms which supported her, and which she did not seem in the least to burden. Mr. Fogg and Sir Francis stood erect. The Parsee bowed his head, and Passepartout was, no doubt, scarcely less stupefied. The resuscitated Rajah approached Sir Francis and Mr. Fogg, and in an abrupt tone said, "Let us be off." It was Passepartout himself, who had slipped upon the pyre in the midst of the smoke, and, profiting by the still overhanging darkness, had delivered the young woman from death. It was Passepartout who, playing his part with a happy audacity, had passed through the crowd amid the general terror. A moment after all four of the party had disappeared in the woods, and the elephant was bearing them away at a rapid pace. The cries and noise, and a ball which whizzed through Phileas Fogg's head, apprised them that the trick had been discovered. The old Rajah's body indeed now appeared upon the burning pyre, and the priests, recovered from their terror, perceived that an abduction had taken place. They hastened into the forest, followed by the soldiers, who fired a volley after the fugitives. But the latter rapidly increased the distance between them, and ere long found themselves beyond the reach of bullets and arrows. End of Chapter 13. Chapter 14, in which Phileas Fogg descends the whole length of the beautiful Valley of Ganges without ever thinking of seeing it. The rash exploit had been accomplished. For an hour Passepartout laughed gaily at his success. Sir Francis pressed the worthy fellow's hand, and his master said, "Well done," which from him was high commendation. To which Passepartout replied that all the credit of the affair belonged to Mr. Fogg. As for him, he'd only been struck with a queer idea, and he laughed to think that for a few moments he, Passepartout, the ex-gymnast, ex-sergeant fireman, had been the spouse of a charming woman, a venerable embalmed Rajah. As for the young Indian woman, she had been unconscious throughout what was passing, and now, wrapped up in a traveling blanket, was reposing in one of the howdahs. The elephant, thanks to the skillful guidance of the Parsee, was advancing rapidly through the still darksome forest, and, an hour after leaving the pagoda, had crossed a vast plain. They made a halt at 7 o'clock, The young woman being still in a state of complete prostration. The guide made her drink a little brandy and water, but the drowsiness which stupefied her could not be shaken off. Sir Francis, who was familiar with the effects of intoxication produced by the fumes of hemp, reassured his companions on her account, but he was more disturbed at the prospect of her future fate. He told Phileas Fogg that, should Aouda remain in India, she would inevitably fall in again into the hands of her executioners. These fanatics were scattered throughout the country, and would, despite the English police, recover their victim at Madras, Bombay or Calcutta. She could only be safe by quitting India forever. Phileas Fogg replied that he would reflect upon the matter. The station at Allahabad was reached about 10 o'clock, and the interrupted line of railway being resumed would enable them just to reach Calcutta in less than 24 hours. Phileas Fogg would thus be able to arrive in time to take the steamer which left Calcutta on the next day, October 25th, at noon for Hong Kong. The young woman was placed in one of the waiting rooms of the station, whilst Passepartout was charged with purchasing for her various articles of toilet, a dress shawl and some furs, for which his master gave him unlimited credit. Passepartout started off forthwith and found himself in the streets of Allahabad, that is, the City of God, one of the most venerated in India, being built at the junction of two sacred rivers, Ganges and Jumna, the waters of which attract pilgrims from every part of the peninsula. The Ganges, according to the legends of the Ramayana, rises in heaven, whence, owing to Brahma's agency, it descends to the earth. Passepartout made it a point, as he makes his purchases, to take a good look at the city. It was formerly defended by a noble fort, which has since become a state prison. Its commerce has dwindled away, and Passepartout in vain looked about for him such a bazaar as he used to frequent in Regent Street. At last he came upon an elderly crusty Jew who sold second-hand articles, from whom he purchased a dress of Scotch stuff, a large mantle, a fine otter-skin pelisse, for which he did not hesitate to pay £75, and then he returned triumphantly to the station. The influence to which the priests of Pelagie had subjected Aouda began to gradually yield. She became more herself, so that her fine eyes resumed all their soft Indian expression. When the poet-king Ukafu Dowell celebrates the charms of the queen of Ahmednagara, he speaks thus: her shining tresses, divided in two parts, encircle the harmonious contour of her white and delicate cheeks. Brilliant in their glow and freshness, her ebony brows have the form and charm of the bow of Kama, the god of love, and beneath her long silken lashes the purest reflections and celestial lights swim, as in the sacred lakes of the Himalaya. In the black pupils of her great clear eyes, her teeth, fine, equal, and white, glitter between her smiling lips like dewdrops in a passion flower's half-enveloped breast. Her delicately formed ears, her vermilion hands, her little feet curved and tender, as the lotus bud glitter with the brilliancy of the loveliest pearls of the Ceylon. The most dazzling diamonds of Golconda, her narrow and supple waist, which a hand may clasp around, sets forth the outline of her rounded figure and the beauty of her bosom, where youth in its flower displays the wealth of its treasures, and beneath the silken folds of her tunic she seems to have been molded in pure silver by the godlike hand of Vikvakarma, the immortal sculptor. It is enough to say, without applying this poetical rhapsody to Aouda, that she was a charming woman. In all the European acception of the phrase, she spoke English with great purity, and the guide had not exaggerated in saying that the young Parsi had been transformed by her bringing up. The train was about to start from Allahabad, and Mr. Fogg proceeded to pay the guide the price agreed upon for his service, and not a farthing more, which astonished Passepartout, who remembered all his master owed to the guide's devotion. He had indeed risked his life in the adventure at the Pelagie, and if he should be caught afterwards by the Indians, he would with difficulty escape their vengeance. Keone must be disposed of, but what should be done with the elephant, which he had so dearly purchased? Phileas Fogg had already determined this question. "Parsi," he said to the guide, "he has been serviceable and devoted. I have paid for your service, but not for your devotion. Would you like to have this elephant? He is yours." The guide's eyes glistened. "Your honour is giving me a fortune," cried he. "Take him, guide," returned Mr. Fogg, "and I shall still be your debtor." "Good," exclaimed Passepartout. "Take him, friend. Keone is a brave and faithful beast." And going up to the elephant, he gave him several lumps of sugar, saying, "Here, Keone, here." The elephant grunted out of his satisfaction, and clasping Passepartout around the waist with his trunk, lifted him as high as his head. Passepartout, not the least of arm, caressed the animal, which replaced him gently on the ground. Soon after, Phileas Fogg, Sir Francis Cromarty, and Passepartout, installed in a carriage with Aouda, who had the best seat, were whirling at full speeds towards Benares. It was a run of 80 miles and was accomplished in 2 hours. During the journey, the young woman fully recovered her senses. What was her astonishment to find herself in this carriage, on the railway, dressed in European habiliments, and with travellers who were quite strangers to her. Her companions first set about fully reviving her with a little liquor, and then Sir Francis narrated to her what had passed, dwelling upon the courage at which Phileas Fogg had not hesitated to risk his life to save her, and recounting the happy sequel of the venture, the result of Passepartout's rash idea. Mr. Fogg said nothing, while Passepartout, abashed, kept repeating that it wasn't worth telling. Iota pathetically thanked her deliverers, rather with tears than words. Her fine eyes interpreted her gratitude better than her lips. Then, as her thoughts strayed back to the scene of the sacrifice and recalled the dangers which still menaced her, she shuddered with terror. Phileas Fogg understood what was passing in Iota's mind, and offered, in order to reassure her, to escort her to Hong Kong, where she might remain safely until the affair was hushed up, an offer she eagerly and gratefully accepted. She had, it seems, a posse relation, who was one of the principal merchants of Hong Kong, which is wholly an English city, based on an island in the Chinese coast. At 12:30, the train stopped at Benares. The Brahmin legends assert that this city is built on the site of an ancient Kasi, which, like Mahomet's tomb, was once suspended between heaven and earth, though the Benares of today, which all the Orientalists call the Athens of India, stands quite unpoetically on the solid earth. Passepartout caught glimpses of its brick houses and clay huts, giving an aspect of desolation to the place as the train entered it. Benares was Sir Francis Cromarty's destination, the troops he was rejoining being encamped some miles northward of the city. He bade adieu to Phileas Fogg, wishing him all success and expressing the hope that he would come that way again in a less original but more profitable fashion. Mr. Fogg lightly pressed him by the hand. The parting of Iota, who did not forget that she owed Sir Francis, betrayed more warmth. As for Passepartout, he received a hearty shake of the hand from the gallant general. The railway, on leaving Benares, passed for a little while along the valley of the Ganges. Through the windows of the carriage, the travellers had glimpses of the diversified landscape of Bihar, with its mountains clothed in verdure, its fields of barley, wheat, and corn, its jungles peopled with green alligators, its neat villages, and its thickly leaved forests. Elephants were bathing in the waters of the sacred river, and groups of Indians, despite the advanced season and chilly air, were performing solemnly their pious ablutions. These were fervent Brahmins, the bitterest foes of Buddhism, their deities being Vishnu, the solar god, Shiva, the divine impersonation of natural forces, and the Brahma, the supreme ruler of priests and legislators. What would these divinities think of India, anglicized as it is today, with steamers whistling and scuttling along the Ganges, frightening the gulls which float upon its surface, the turtles swarming along its banks, and the faithful dwelling upon its borders? The panorama passed before their eyes like a flash, save when the steam concealed it fitfully from the view. The travellers could scarcely discern the fort of Chupanay, 20 miles southwestward from Benares, the ancient stronghold of the Rajas of Bihar, or Ghazipur, and from the famous rose water factories, or the tomb of Lord Cornwallis, resting on the left bank of the Ganges, the fortified town of Buxar, or Patna, a large manufacturing and trading place, where is held the principal opium market of India, or Mangir, a more European town, for it is English, as Manchester or Birmingham, with black iron foundries, edge tool factories, and high chimneys puffing clouds of black smoke heavenward. Night came on. The train passed on at full speed, in the midst of a roaring of the tigers, bears, and wolves which fled before the locomotive, and the marbles of Bengal, Golconda, ruined Gur, Moshirabad, the ancient capital, Burdwan, Hujli, and the French town of Chandigarh, where Passepartout would have been so proud to see his country's flag flying, were hidden from their view in the darkness. Calcutta was reached at 7 in the morning, and the packet left for Hong Kong at noon, so that Phileas Fogg had 5 hours before him. According to his journal, he was due at Calcutta on the 25th of October, and that was the exact date of his actual arrival. He was therefore neither behindhand nor ahead of time. The 2 days' game between London and Bombay had been lost, as had been seen in the journey across India, but it is not supposed that Phileas Fogg regretted them. End of Chapter 14. Chapter 15, in which the bag of banknotes disgorges some thousands of pounds more. The train entered the station, and Passepartout, jumping out first, was followed by Mr. Fogg, who assisted his fair companion to descend. Phileas Fogg intended to proceed at once to the Hong Kong steamer, in order to get Iota comfortably settled for the voyage. He was unwilling to leave her while they were still on dangerous ground. Just as he was leaving the station, a policeman came up to him and said, "Mr. Phileas Fogg, I am he." "Is this man your servant?" asked the policeman, pointing to Passepartout. "Yes. Be so good, both of you, as to follow me." Mr. Fogg betrayed no surprise whatsoever. The policeman was a representative of the law, and the law is sacred to an Englishman. Passepartout tried to reason about the matter, but the policeman tapped him with a stick, and Mr. Fogg made a signal to obey. "May this young lady go with us?" asked he. "She may," replied the policeman. Mr. Fogg, Aouda, and Passepartout were conducted into a palkigari, a sort of four-wheeled carriage drawn by two horses, in which they took their places and were driven away. No one spoke during the 20 minutes which elapsed before they reached their destination. They first passed through the black town, with its narrow streets and miserable dirty huts and the squalid population, then through the European town, which presented a relief in its bright brick mansions, shaded by cocoanut trees and bristling with masts where, although it was early morning, elegantly dressed horsemen in handsome equipages were passing back and forth. The carriage stopped before a modest-looking house, which, however, did not have the appearance of a private mansion. The policeman, having requested his prisoners for so truly they might be so called to descend, conducted them into a room with barred windows and said, "You will appear before Judge Obadiah at 8:30. He then retired and closed the doors. "Why, we are prisoners!" exclaimed Passepartout, falling into a chair. Aouda, with an emotion she tried to conceal, said to Mr. Fogg, "Sir, you must leave me to my fate. It is on my account that you received this treatment. It is for having saved me." Phileas Fogg contented himself with saying that was impossible. It was quite unlikely that he should be arrested for preventing a suttee. The complainants would never dare present themselves with such a charge. There was some mistake. Moreover, he could not, in any event, abandon Aouda, but would escort her to Hong Kong. "But the steamer leaves at noon," observed Passepartout nervously. "We shall be on board by noon," replied his master placidly. It was said so positively that Passepartout could not help but muttering to himself, "Blah, blah, that's certain. Before noon we shall be on board." But he was no means reassured. At 8:30 the door opened. The policeman appeared and, requesting them to follow him, led the way to an adjoining hall. It was evidently a courtroom, and a crowd of Europeans and natives had already occupied the rear of the apartment. Mr. Fogg and his two companions took their places on a bench opposite the desks of the magistrate and his clerk. Immediately after, Judge Obadiah, a fat, round man, followed by the clerk, entered. He proceeded to take down a wig which was hanging on a nail, and put it hurriedly on his head. "The first, guys," said he, then putting his hand to his head, exclaimed, "Hey, this is not my wig." "Now, your worship," returned the clerk, "it's mine." "My dear Mr. Oysterpuff, how can a judge give a wise sentence in a clerk's wigs?" The wigs were exchanged. Passepartout was getting nervous, for the hands on the face of the big clock over the judge seemed to go around with terrible rapidity. "The first case," repeated Judge Obadiah. "Phileas Fogg?" demanded Oysterpuff. "I am here," replied Mr. Fogg. "Passepartout?" "Present," responded Passepartout. "Good," said the judge. "You have been looked for, prisoners, for 2 days on the trains from Bombay." "But of what are we accused?" asked Passepartout impatiently. "You're about to be informed." "I am an English subject, sir," said Mr. Fogg, "and I have the right—" "Have you been ill-treated?" "Not at all." "Very well. Let the complainants come in." A door was swung open by the order of the judge, and 3 Indian priests entered. "That's it," muttered Passepartout. "These are the rogues who are going to burn my young lady." The priests took their places in front of the judge, and the clerk proceeded to read a loud voice a complaint of sacrilege against Phileas Fogg and his servant, who was accused of having violated a place held consecrated by the Brahmin religion. "You hear the charge?" "Yes, sir," replied Mr. Fogg, consulting his watch, "and I admit it." "You admit it?" "I admit it, and I wish to hear these priests admit it, in their turn, what they are going to do at the pagoda of the Pelagi." The priests looked at each other. They did not seem to understand what was said. "Yes," cried Passepartout warmly, "at the pagoda of Pelagi, where they were on the point of burning their victim." The judge stared with astonishment, and the priests were stupefied. "What victim?" said Judge Obadiah. "Burn whom? In Bombay itself?" "Bombay?" cried Passepartout. "Certainly. We're not talking of the pagoda at Pelagi, but of the pagoda at Mambar Hill at Bombay." "And as a proof," added the clerk, "here to desecrate his very shoes which he left behind him." Whereupon he placed a pair of shoes on his desk. "My shoes!" cried Passepartout, in his surprise permitting this imprudent exclamation to escape him. The confusion of master and man, who had quite forgotten the affair at Bombay for which they were now detained at Calcutta, may be imagined. Fix, the detective, had foreseen the advantage which Passepartout's escapade gave him, and, delaying his departure for 12 hours, had consulted the priests of Malabar Hill, knowing that the English authorities dealt very severely with this kind of misdemeanor. He promised them a goodly sum in damages, and sent them forward to Calcutta by the next train, owing to the delay caused by the rescue of the young widow. Fix and the priest reached the Indian capital before Mr. Fogg and his servants. The magistrates, having already been warned by a dispatch to arrest them should they arrive, fixed his disappointment when he learned that Phileas Fogg had not made his appearance in Calcutta may be imagined. He made up his mind had the robbers stopped somewhere on the route and taken refuge in the southern provinces. For 24 hours Fix watched the station with feverish anxiety. At last he was rewarded by seeing Mr. Fogg and Passepartout arrived, accompanied by a young woman, whose presence he was wholly at a loss to explain. He hastened for a policeman, and this was how the party came to be arrested and brought before Judge Obadiah. Had Passepartout been a little less preoccupied, he would have espied the detective ensconced in a corner of the courtroom, watching the proceedings with an interest easily understood, for the warrant had failed to reach him at Calcutta, as it had done in Bombay and Suez. Judge Obadiah had unfortunately caught Passepartout's rash exclamation, which the poor fellow would have given the world to recall. "The facts are admitted?" asked the judge. "Admitted," replied Mr. Fogg coldly. "It is much," resumed the judge, "as the English law protects equally sternly the religions of the Indian people, and as the man Passepartout has admitted that he violated the sacred pagoda of the Malabar Hill at Bombay on the 20th of October, I condemn the said Passepartout to imprisonment for 15 days and a fine of £300. £300! cried Passepartout, startled at the largeness of the sum. "Solid!" shouted the constable. "And inasmuch," continued the judge, "it is not proved, and the act was not done by the connivance of the master with the servant, and as the master in any case must be held responsible for the acts of his paid servant, I condemn Phileas Fogg to a week's imprisonment and a fine of £150. Fix rubbed his hands softly with satisfaction. If Phileas Fogg could be detained in Calcutta for a week, it would be more than time for the warrant to arrive. Passepartout was stupefied. This sentence ruined his master. A wager of £20,000 lost because he, like a precious fool, had gone in that abominable pagoda. Phileas Fogg, as self-composed as if the judgment did not in the least concern him, did not even lift his eyebrows while it was being pronounced. Just as the clerk was calling the next case, he rose and said, "I offer bail." "You have that right," returned the judge. Fix's blood ran cold, but he resumed his composure when he heard the judge announce that the bail required for each prisoner would be £1,000. "I will pay it at once," said Mr. Fogg, taking a roll of bank bills from the carpet-bag which Passepartout had by him and placing them on the clerk's desk. "The sum will be restored to you upon your release from prison," said the jail. "Meanwhile, you are liberated on bail." "Come," said Phileas Fogg to a servant. "But let them at least give me my black shoes," cried Passepartout angrily. "Ah, these are pretty dear shoes," he muttered, as they were handed to him. "More than £1,000 apiece, besides. They pinch my feet." Mr. Fogg, offering his arm to Aouda, then departed, followed by the crestfallen Passepartout. Fix still nourished hopes that the robber would not, after all, leave the £2,000 behind him, but would decide to serve out his week in jail, and issued forth on Mr. Fogg's traces. That gentleman took a carriage, and the party were soon landed on one of the quays. The Rangoon was moored half a mile off in the harbour, its signal of departure hoisted at the masthead. 11 o'clock was striking. Mr. Fogg was an hour in advance of time. Fix saw them leave the carriage and push off in a boat for the steamer, and stamped his feet with disappointment. "Rascal is off after all," he exclaimed. £2,000 sacrificed. He's a prodigal as a thief. I'll follow him to the end of the world if necessary, but at the rate he's going on, his stolen money will soon be exhausted. The detective was not far wrong in making this conjecture. Since leaving London, what with travelling expenses, bribes, the purchase of an elephant, bails and fines, Mr. Fogg had already spent more than £5,000 on the way, and the percentage of the sum recovered from the bank robber promised to the detectives was rapidly diminishing. End of chapter 15.